Bueno, orain goizean ere aurreratu dugu eta arratsaldeko saio honetara, gure mugetatik kanpoko 3 adibide. Oso desberdin gainera jarri nahi izan ditugu. Iruditzen zaigulako, 3 gonbidatu hauen ekarpenak, interesgarriak izango zaizkigula guri ere, etorkizunari begira, Arnasguneak babesteko, sustatzeko eta edatzeko proposamenak jorratu behar baditu. Gainera, goizean zehar ikusi ditut, denbora guztian, oharrak hartzen orduan, sufratzen dut, hasieran pentsatuta zeukaten interbentzioa eta orain goizean entzundakoarekin edo horre hartu izen noarrekin, desberdina izango dela. Bai, antolatzaileen izenean eskerrak eman nahi dizkiet, ona bertatzeragatik, badakidalako agenda nahiko beteak dituztela eta, esfortzu handia egin dutela beraien esperientziak gurekin partekatzeko. Esan bezala, 3 hizkuntza komunitate edo lurraldeko ordezkaria ditugu, batetik Finlandiako estatuan kokatuta dauden Aland uharteetako ordezkaria, bestetik Belgikako estatuan kokatuta dagoen Flandria, eta azkenik Erresuma Batuan kokatuta dagoen Gales. Metodologia nahiko simplea izango da, beraiei, 30 minutuko ekarpena egiteko eskatu zitzaien, eta horren ostean, zabalduko dugu txanda, gure galderak edo kezkak argitzeko. Eta lehenarekin hasita, Alan uharteekin hasita, Elisabezik komentatu genionean bertara etortzeko, Alan uharteetako esku horri bat bidali zigun, gero hemen batzuk ekarri ditu guztio jasotzeko, eta esku horri horretan Alan uhartei buruzko definizio bat agertzen zen, eta honela agertzen zen. Alan uharteak Finlandiako eskualde suediera estun, autonomo eta desmilitarizatua da. Eta, nire oso bitxia egin zitzaidan, beraien burua definitzen dutenean, azken finean hizkuntza delako ardatzetako bat, beraien lurraldea definitzeko. Egia da askotan, Euskal Herrian eta bai soziolinguistikan eta hizkuntzen kudeaketan eta horri ikastaroak egin izan ditugunean, askotan Finlandia aipatu izan dela, hain zen ere, bertan pertsonaltasun printzipioa aplikatzen delako, baina Elisabeti beste eskaeratxo bat egin genion, ezta? Esan dugudan bezala, Alan uharteek beren burua suediera hiztun definitzen dute, eta beraz, Alan uharteak suedieraren arnasgune bat da. Eta gainera, arnasgunea izateaz gain, hori horrela izan dadin, lan handia egin dutela, eta gure ustez garrantzitsuena da, arautu egin dutela. Benetan, Alan uhartean suediera hizkuntza nagusia izan dadin. 1921 nazioen ligak erabaki zuen, uharte horiek Finlandiaren mende geratuko zirela, baina berak azalduko duen bezala baldintzetako bat suediera hizkuntza mantentzea izan zen. Horregatik, Elisabeti besteak beste eskatu genion, hizkuntzen eremuan dagoen araudiari buruzko kokapen bat edo aurkezpen bat egiteko. Elisabet Naukler politikari eta legeria da eta Finlandiako parlamentuko ordezkaria. Are gehiago, Alan eskualderako parlamentuko ordezkari bakarra da. Zuzenbidean lizentziatua eta ibilbide politiko luzea duena. Ziren Alaneko administrazioan, bertan egon zen 1979-tik 2006 urtera arte, eta 2011an Finlandiako parlamentuko kide hautatu zuten. Eta nik ez dakat beste esateko, eskerrak beste bin Elisabet, eta zurea daitza.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very much looking forward to this. I've, as you said, brought a lot of brochures here. I think that we have this little Åland brochure in 14 languages because very many people are interested in the Åland autonomy, but not yet in the Basque language. I hope there is someone here who would like to translate it. So the Åland Islands has territorial, cultural, and linguistic autonomy, as was outlined by the League of Nations in 1921. This was the result of a conflict in 1917 at the time when Finland was gaining its independence. Before that, Finland and the Åland Islands had belonged to Sweden until 1809, when Sweden lost the Åland Islands and Finland to Russia. And the Russians started to fortify the Ålands immediately because the islands are they're very important from a strategical point of view. They could control St. Petersburg, Stockholm, etc. if you had the islands. They built an enormous fortress that was planned to be enormous, but it was never ready when in 1854 part of the Crimean War took place in the Åland Islands. France and Britain, a united fleet, very rare, defeated the Russians. And the Russians had to, in a treaty in Paris in 1856, promise never to fortify the islands anymore. This is important because this is the first time when the islands were on the international arena, and there was an international treaty involving the Åland Islands. Well, Finland became independent in 1917 in December. Before that, when they started to discuss the independence, then the islanders also started to discuss what would happen to them. This was the time of the end of the First World War. It was the time of the Russian Revolution, and they didn't know if they would be part of Russia, and where they would only speak Russian, or part of an independent Finnish state where they would only speak Finnish. We know now that Finland is a bilingual country, but they did not know. So they decided to turn to the Swedish king, to their kin state, and ask to be reunited, also the Swedish prime minister. And they also made not a real referendum, but a petition, and it is said that 96% of the people who were at home at that time, because many were out sailors, voted or signed this petition. But it doesn't matter if it was 96%. It was an overwhelming majority. Now the king and the representatives in Stockholm, they received them and they were very positive, etc. But nothing happened because, as I said, it was a very dangerous time in the world. So nothing happened until the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau made a statement in Paris in connection with the peace treaty after the First War, the Versailles Treaty, and said something vague like, we will probably be able to meet the interests of Sweden. Then they woke up in Finland and got scared and afraid what would happen. There, as you've already heard, Finland is a bilingual country. There is a Swedish, not a minority, because there are 2 language groups in Finland, but of course it's a de facto minority. This was not a poor, illiterate minority. It was a minority with a lot of power, and they had several ministers in the government, and for them it was extremely important to have the Åland Islands and not lose them. So they managed to convince the Finnish majority that the country should be bilingual, to show the world that it was a civilized country that could accommodate the question of the Åland Islands. And this succeeded. It was decided in Paris that the question was not, it should not be dealt with in Versailles. It was a security question. It should be brought to the League of Nations, and Britain brought it to the League of Nations in 1921. And that was maybe also one of the reasons why the Ålanders turned to Sweden, not only for linguistic reasons, but also for security reasons. They trusted more in the old Swedish state than in the new, fragile Finnish state. So, to make this story that I could speak for hours about, but the League of Nations decided that the islands should be under Finnish sovereignty, but with guarantees that the islands forever would be able to preserve their Swedish language and culture. And the quotation is, Finland resolved to assure and to guarantee to the population of the Åland Islands the preservation of their language, of their culture, and of their local Swedish traditions. This was considered as possible as Finland had earlier laid down in their constitution, as I already said, that Finland was a bilingual country. Both Swedish and Finnish were official languages in the country. The Åland solution was labeled a minority solution. It was to protect a nationality with very strong elements of protection, most likely because of the few inhabitants that were to be protected. At that time, 22,000. Now we are about 28, 29,000. It's the only island in the Baltic where the population is increasing and has been increasing over decades. Well, this was one, Finland was in a way quite desperate to have the islands. And many people, of course, today, also in Sweden, they say, how could this be the result when an overwhelming majority of the people wanted to belong to Sweden? How could this happen? Well, Finland was just newly became independent. They had fought the bloody war against the Bolsheviks. To rip away one part of their country would have been really a big issue. So that is probably one of the reasons. They had nothing to copy at that time. This was one of the first autonomous solutions. So there are many mechanisms and elements in the Åland autonomy that has been copied later on, but that they could not look it up. As it was a conflict between Sweden and Finland, they were given, these two states, they were given 3 days to accept this solution or not. And the Ålanders had no role in this themselves. And the two parties, Sweden and Finland, they agreed to accept the Åland Autonomy Act that the Ålanders had refused earlier, that this should be implemented, but with some certain guarantees. There were some paragraphs that should be added to the Autonomy Act, and these are called the Guarantee Law. What was in the Guarantee Law was repeated in the two following Autonomy Acts from 1953 and 1993. I'm not come here to speak about the Åland autonomy as a conflict resolution mechanism, which I normally do, so I can't avoid it. I spent 3.5 years in the war in former Yugoslavia, and I've been around in many conflict areas. So, but it's inevitable to say that we have two parliaments, that's a divided legal competition between the parliament in Finland and the parliament in Åland Islands. We have quite an extensive autonomy. We do not have the fiscal rights, but we have such a strong position that we could have remained outside the European Union when Finland became members. Just like the Faroe Islands and Greenland, they are, of course, our good friends, as they are also in the Nordic cooperation. So we always compare ourselves with them. Well, paragraph 1 in this guarantee text I already read, and that says that Finland resolved to assure and to guarantee to the population of the Åland Islands the preservation of their language, of their culture, and of their local Swedish traditions, and undertook to shortly introduce in the Autonomy Act the following guarantees. The Åland Parliament and the municipalities shall not in any case be obliged to support or to subsidize any other schools than those in which the language of instruction is Swedish. In the scholastic establishments of the state, introductions shall also be given in the Swedish language. The Finnish language may not be taught in the primary schools, supported or subsidized by the state or by the commune without the consent of the interested commune. And so this does not mean that it's forbidden with Finnish schools, but it has to be a private initiative, and there has never been enough interest for such a private initiative. Other restrictions were introduced with the same purpose, to safeguard the language of this very small minority. There were restrictions for purchasing real estate, for land. There were restrictions on who could vote, and maybe most important, the League of Nations should watch over the application. Finland were obliged to pass on any complaints of the Åland Islands, and if it was of a legal nature, to the permanent court in The Hague. This never happened, but I cannot go into that very interesting matter here. The idea behind these restrictions was that, as this was such a tiny population, only 22,000, the idea was not to change the ethnic composition. An entrepreneur should not be able to move from Finland to the Åland Islands, buy a piece of land, start an industry, bring in 1,000 workers with Finnish as mother tongue. They could vote in the election, and it would shortly have changed the whole linguistic situation. So this was the idea behind it. It was all about the language, what happened in the League of Nations. This means that the language of tuition in schools in Åland Islands is Swedish, and only Swedish. Finnish is taught as one of several other foreign languages. It would be possible, as I said, to establish a private school, but this has not happened. Families with children having Finnish as their mother tongue moving to the Åland Islands are very well aware of the fact that the only official language in the islands and in the schools is Swedish. Swedish is also the only language of communication between the authorities of the Åland Islands and the Finnish state. This includes the branches of the Finnish state authorities in the islands, because they are representatives of the Finnish state in the Åland Islands. They also have to communicate with Finland, with Helsinki, in Swedish. So that is the only official language. When Åland got a new Autonomy Act in 1953, then the League of Nations had disappeared, and this is probably why Åland had a form of compensation called the right of domicile. If you have lived 5 years in the islands, of course, if you're born in the islands and your parents are Ålanders, then you will get this by birth. But if you don't get it by birth, and you've lived in the Åland Islands for 5 years, have a Finnish citizenship, then you can acquire this right on domicile, and thereby, without any restrictions, buy land, now also carry out business, and participate in the local elections. So I'm saying without restrictions. This means that if you move to the Åland Islands, anyone can move there. If you move there, get a job there, you can apply for buying a house in the town, and you will get this permission after a year. when it is obvious that this is serious. You've moved there with the family. It's not from stopping people from moving. It is for stopping people living in Helsinki or Stockholm or wherever and speculate in the land. So anyone can move, but you have to have a permission. And the same, if you want to start a business, you need a permission. But if you have this right of domicile, then you don't need any permission. You can never get a permission to vote. For voting, you of course need the right of domicile. You can vote in the presidential election, the President of Finland, in the election for the parliament in Finland, but not for the local elections. This was what it was like in 1953. And this is said to have been a compensation for the fact that the League of Nations had disappeared and that it was no international control of this autonomy anymore. But in 1993, Åland had a third autonomy, and now, but not until 1993, another condition was added to get the right of domicile, namely knowledge of the Swedish language. This was not there before that. What the Ålanders also, as I said, everything was about the language in Geneva. The Ålanders are exempted from military service. And many people think that this has to do with the demilitarization of the Åland Islands. So they said, we have to defend the Ålanders. They can't even defend themselves. But it has nothing to do with the military or the defense. It has to do with the language. Finland could not guarantee that they could use only Swedish as soldiers. Now there is a Swedish division, but it wasn't at that time. And even if there is a Swedish unit, the language of command in the Finnish army is Finnish. This is the official explanation, but there are few countries in the world where they want to have a minority in the military who has opted for becoming part of another country. I mean, this is also part of the history in former Yugoslavia. They don't want to have these people in their army. But as I said, officially it's a linguistic reason. So the Ålanders were then, they had other duties, and these duties has never been as piloting in the sea, for example, but this has never happened. Now I would like to show this chapter 6. So, is this where I will find it? Or if someone can help me. Yeah, maybe it's here. There it is. This is the chapter about the language in our Autonomy Act. The autonomy of the Åland Islands is not entrenched or laid down in the Finnish constitution. It's an international decision that the two parties agreed on within 3 days. In the Finnish constitution, it only says that the Åland Islands have autonomy as is stated in the Autonomy Act of the Åland Islands. The Autonomy Act is not a constitution, but it's a constitutional law passed in the same way as a constitution, and even with a stronger guarantee, because it should also be agreed by the Åland Parliament. Today, I think that today they would, in such a conflict situation, have spoken about integration. Assimilation is never acceptable when it comes to minorities, but integration. At that time, it was not a question of integration, it was permanent guarantees for the Swedish language. It was a forever solution. I don't know if I should really use the time now on reading this. I don't know if you can, maybe, you see that the official language of Åland is Swedish. This is what I've spoken about mostly. And I don't have time to go into what the Åland delegation is, but that's a body, arbitrary body between Finland and Åland with representatives from both sides. They also only use the Swedish language, and in contacts with the Supreme Court, everything should be in Swedish. The church. But as you see in paragraph 37, a Finnish citizen has the right to use Finnish. But as you see, it is in front of other state officials. So it is not with the municipalities or the Åland authorities. There is one, and as you can see, the language of correspondence is Swedish. Here we have a special paragraph that is interesting. This came in 1994. You see this text here from 1994, where they say that if a treaty only exists in another language, it can be sent to Åland. This is because of the European Union, because it was not possible to send English or French texts to the Åland Islands as it was possible to Finland, because it said that it only had to be in Swedish. So this is why this was changed, that it can also be sent in English or French or German or Spanish or whatever to the Åland Islands. Here you see that there is one paragraph saying that that the Åland authorities, the government of Åland, they will have to provide a text in Finnish if someone asks for it, but it doesn't say that they have to know Finnish, that they have to produce it, but that they have to see to that there is a translation. So unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through this. I would be happy to. I hope that you can read this yourself, because I think that I only have a few minutes left, 5. So I will say that we have, well, let me put a question. Is this a good solution? Yes, it must have been good, as it's one of the few conflicts that has been settled by an international organization in a sustainable way. But is it a model? I would say there are no models. Territorial autonomy is a form for collective rights and implies that everyone is included. It is not possible to opt out, as in the case of personal autonomy. The members of the Swedish-speaking community in Finland, they have personal autonomy. A person can decide that he or she belongs to the Swedish-speaking community or not in Finland. Finland is a bilingual country, as laid down in the Constitution, and ruled by the Special Language Act from 2003. This act does not apply to the Åland Islands. The Sami people in the north of Finland have special rights to protect their language, as laid down in the Constitution of Finland. The Sami people is, according to United Nations definition, an indigenous people. The fact that Finland has all these different regimes in the same country is unique and in itself a model, but it is very difficult to copy one of the components. I'm not here to talk on the legal framework in Finland, what is in the constitution, but this is very interesting. I'm a member of the Constitutional Commission in Finland, and we are dwelling on a certain paragraph in the Finnish constitution saying, in the organization of administration, the objective should be suitable territorial divisions so that the Finnish-speaking and Swedish-speaking populations have an opportunity to receive services in their own language on equal terms. The principles governing the municipal divisions are laid down by an act. What does this mean? Well, that is what we are spending hours and hours and hours at in the Constitutional Committee, but this has nothing to do with the Åland Islands, because Åland Islands is not bilingual. So I shall not here dwell on this very interesting problem. There have been discussions on whether it would be more productive for the Swedish speakers in Finland to have the status of a minority and thereby be able to make reference to all international standards on minorities and minority languages, but the discussion did not result in any initiatives to change the status. Their position is striking. Finland has two Finland has two national languages. It's acceptable to have such a strong protection of the language. Is it acceptable to have such a strong protection of the language as in the Åland Islands? Yes, I think so, as the population in question is so small and would never have survived without these protection mechanisms, and with the support of the kin state Sweden should be added. Sweden has, through the years, supported the mechanism, and with the support supported the Åland Islands in areas where the language is important, such as education, media, social and health care, and maybe the Åland Island is what was earlier labeled a linguistic protected area. We have 75% of our students going to Sweden today. Sweden is a very important kin state. But are there no problems? The Åland autonomy is very often in Finland depicted as a form for privilege, resulting in nationalistic groups attacking the solution, using arguments such as there should be minority rights for the representatives of the Finnish majority living in the islands. There are no such legal notions as minority rights for the majority population living in a minority area. This does not mean that there are not human rights that should be respected. People moving to the Åland Islands are aware of the fact that the schools are only in Swedish, and it seldom causes problems. We have today 92 nations represented in the islands and more than 40 different languages. It is not an isolated society. It's not excluding foreigners. Everyone can move there. But there is no doubt Åland is protecting itself from the Finnish language. We can often hear this, you can speak English, you don't protect yourself from English. And I used to say in Quebec they are protecting themselves from English, not from Finnish. And of course, we are protecting ourselves from Finnish. It's always a question of minority and majority languages. There is no doubt that the language climate in Finland is changing and more nationalistic feelings are stirred up. We will this spring receive a so-called citizens' initiative in the Finnish Parliament concerning teaching the Swedish language as a compulsory subject in schools in Finland. 50,000 signatures are required for such an initiative to be brought to the Parliament, but the expression used in this initiative is not compulsory Swedish, but forced Swedish, having a very pejorative connotation, and somehow the word forced is related to a form of violence. This has nothing to do with the Åland Islands, but it is difficult to operate in a serious manner and be treated with respect in such an atmosphere. I spoke this summer in Transylvania and Hungary, and they were extremely upset when they heard this, because they said, this is not a Finnish question, this is an international question. Finland is our model. Finland has always been a model, and now you're destroying it. I assume that I have to finish now. The Ålanders are stronger when it comes to protecting their language than the Swedish speakers in Finland, no doubt about it. I'm the only one speaking only Swedish in the Finnish parliament. People very often ask me, do you have an interpreter? And I say, no, I don't have an interpreter. It's the people who do not understand what I'm saying. They have an interpreter. Finland is a bilingual country, and both languages, you can speak both languages in the parliament, and I do understand Finnish, so I don't need an interpreter. And I often say to the interpreter, if they come close to me, I say, why don't you go and sit with the people who don't understand what I'm saying? But while the Swedish speakers in Finland, they tend to turn over to Finnish as they can speak Finnish. But I think this is my obligation as representing the Åland Islands, and to show that Swedish is still a language that is alive in Finland. It's not only a language that is told in fairy tales. And I would I will end with saying that, as I already said, it is very often that we hear that the Åland Islands have a form for privileges, but it is never a privilege. It's a compensation for the fact that the Ålanders did not get their will through to belong to their kin state, and it is never, never a privilege to be a minority, to be a privilege that is to have the same language as the majority in the country. Thank you very much.
Eskerrik asko, Elisabet, zu gero, eztabaidarako hainbat elementu atara direla. Lehen esan dute soziolinguistikari edo hizkuntza eragintzari buruzko ikastaroetan, normalean pertsonatasun printzipioaren eredu Finlandia jartzen zaigula, eta lurraldetasun printzipioaren eredu azaltzen zaiguna normalean Belgika esten da adibidea, ezta? Belgika, Flandria, Valonia eta bar. Eta, urrengo gonbidatua Flandriatik datorkigu, Wilfried van Dele, eta, zergatik aukeratu dugu Flandriako adibidea. Iruditzen zaigu, Flandria bera ere lurraldetasun printzipio hori erabat lotzen zaiola Arnasguneen kontzeptuari. Azken finean, lurraldetasun printzipioen arabera, lurraldea da hizkuntza horretan bizi dena eta pertsona lurraldeko hizkuntzari moldatu behar zaizkio eta ez alerantziz. Hala ere, egia ere bada, Flandriak egoera desberdinak bizi dituela, hau da, ez da gauza bera Flandrian Nederlanderak daukan egoera edo Flandriaren barruan kokatzen den Bruselan, Brusela, hiri elebiduna ditzen den horretan, zein den Nederlandaren egoera, ez? Hizkuntzaren garapena kontrako norantza hartu du batean eta bestean gainera, azken urteotan, beste fenomeno bat gertatzen ari da Flandrian, izan ere, Brusela inguruko lurralde eremuetara, nolaiko migrazio mugimenduak egon dira, Brusela inguruko eremu horiek Flandriaren lurraldean kokatzen dira, baina migrazio mugimenduetan gehienak frankofonoak dira. Orduan horrek ere, hainbat arazo sortu ditu Flandrian. Eta horren ondorio zenbait neurri ere hartu behar izan dute. Hori guztia azaltzeko, esan bezala, Wilfried van Dele gonbidatu dugu, bera masterra du errendaerazko eta ingelesazko literaturan eta komunikazio eta hedabideen zientzietan. Dutch Feminist Congress Foundation erakundeko idazkari nagusia izan da, Flandriako ingurumen agentziako komunikazio buru ere, eta 1918-2009 urteetan, Flandriaren eta Holandaen arteko itun kulturalaren idazkari nagusia izan zen. Horren bidez, Flandriako eta Holandako gobernuei aholkuak egiten zitzaizkien hezkuntzan, kulturan, zientzian eta abar. 2009an, Flandriako parlamentuko kide hautatu zuten, eta besteak beste, bere alderdi NVA kultura aferetarako batzordean ordezkatzen du, eta 2013an Belgikako senadore izendatu zuten, eta bertan Flandriako parlamentua ordezkatzen du. Eta, politikan ere, gizarte mugimenduetan baina politikan ere, eskarmentu handiko gizona dugu Wilfried. Hortaz, Wilfried, zurea da hitza.
Ladies and gentlemen, my beautiful assistant, Irati. Have another beautiful assistant, Paul. He will switch the slides, because I can't read Basque. Arratzalde on, is that okay? It's always dangerous to use another language, to use a language you don't know, ladies and gentlemen. One day, we had an English professor in Flanders, and it was in January, as it is today, and he wanted to say to everybody in present, Happy New Year. And he said, I wish you all a happy birthday. So it's always dangerous to use another language. I'm very, very honored to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to Donostia. You can see that I'm very honored. I'm wearing a tie. I'm the only one here wearing a tie. So I am very honored. Ladies and gentlemen, your struggle for cultural and linguistic rights and for self-government of the Basque country in Spain resembles the struggle of Flanders in Belgium. Here you see Belgium. We have Flanders, we have Wallonia, Flanders Dutch-speaking, Wallonia French-speaking, and then Brussels, as you see, in Flanders, surrounded by Flemish territory, but a bilingual capital. As Paul said before, I became a full-time politician. Someone has to do it. I used to be Secretary General of the Cultural Treaty between Flanders and the Netherlands, because there is a lot of cooperation between Flanders and the Netherlands in the field of culture, in the field of education, etc., also, of course, in the field of language. Dutch is the official language in the Netherlands, but also in Flanders. At home, we often speak Flemish, which is a system of dialects, but our official language is Dutch. So there is no Flemish standard language. We choose to use Dutch because, in fact, the standard Dutch language is something we made together in ancient days, the Dutch and the Flemish, because one time we were one country, so this Dutch language also is the language of the Flemish. Flemish people are the majority in Belgium, but only in 1930, 100 years earlier, Belgium was founded in 1830, but only in 1930 a university, the University of Ghent, was allowed to give courses in Dutch. Before, it was all French. Flanders has 6.5 million inhabitants, the Netherlands almost 17. Together, there are 23 million people speaking Dutch. Dutch is also one of the official languages in the European Union. Here we see a map of Flanders and the Netherlands, the territory speaking Dutch. As you know, today we have 28 member states in the European Union, 25 languages. Dutch occupies the 8th place, so we are not a small language, not as small as Basque, but still, also Dutch is a language under pressure. Belgium was founded in 1830. Officially, the Constitution says that the individual is free to use the language he prefers, although a majority of Belgians was Flemish and spoke Dutch or a Flemish dialect. The official language then, 1830, was French. The upper class used French. The courts, education, the public administration were French. People who wanted to succeed in life had to speak French. So the Frenchification worked very rapidly. And Brussels is a good example. Historically, it was a Flemish city, but today it is a mainly French-speaking city, surrounded, as I showed, by Flemish territory. Mind you, today in Brussels they speak 104 languages, even more than my colleague mentioned for the islands. Since 1860, Flemish people demanded language rights because there were some really unacceptable things going on. Pupils in schools were not allowed to speak Dutch, not even on the playgrounds. They were punished. If they spoke Flemish or Dutch, they had to wash their mouth with soap because it was something you shouldn't do. Some people even were sentenced to death by courts without understanding what was said in the court. 100 years later, in 1960, the language border was established. And that's a very important thing, this language border. Since then, in Belgium, we have 4 language zones: the Dutch zone, Flanders, the French zone, Wallonia, the German zone, small piece near the German border, and the bilingual zone, French and Dutch, being Brussels. Here we see the zones: Dutch, French, to the right there in blue, some German communities, and then Brussels being bilingual. This shows it again. The fact that we established language zones, ladies and gentlemen, with language borders means that we choose for the principle of territoriality, with location-related language rights. We did not choose for the personality principle, with person-related language rights. In Latin is the jus solis versus jus personae. The personality principle means that a person has rights and takes these rights with him, wherever he lives. In that case, as far as language is concerned, public authorities have to adapt to the individual. We did not choose for that model. We choose for the principle of territoriality, which means that a region has language rights and individuals have to adapt to the region, also to other habits of the region, but also to the language. In my opinion, the principle of territoriality is the only system that can work in the public area, and all states that are organized in a federal way, as is Belgium, use this principle. European Court for Human Rights says that this principle is not discriminating. They said that in 1968. So, a region, a society has certain rules, has a certain language, and it is a good thing for individuals to use that language when they want to be part of this society. We heard that this morning several times. At home, in private, people can do whatever they like. They can speak the language they want. They can do even the most bizarre things. As far as I'm concerned, they can stand on their heads, naked, with a dead rabbit between their teeth, singing a song in Swahili. I don't care. But when citizens and authorities communicate, there are certain language rules. When people communicate with each other, according to the law in Flanders, in Belgium, people can use the language they want, but I think it is a good thing for society that in public people use the language of the area. So in Flanders, this is Dutch. In Flanders, as in most countries, when you give your pub a name or your shop, you can choose the language you want. If you have a restaurant, you can put the language on the menu you want. This is free. But you know, in certain other countries, Quebec was mentioned. Quebec also have rules concerning the language used on shops, names of pubs, etc. In Belgium, in Flanders, this is not the case. We need a language breathing space, a cultural space, because it makes us feel at home. It makes us feel safe amongst people we can understand, very important. There is a social cohesion, very important, solidarity, etc. Elements that are, I think, very, very, very important to construct a solid society. The existence of different societies, of different cultures, linguistic and cultural varieties in Europe gives us a richness, a colorful diversity that should be typical for Europe, as opposed to the United States, as you know, which is a melting pot. Europe has not always been very clear on that matter. There has always been a friction between the economic objectives and the cultural objectives. On one hand, nothing must prevent free trade, free traffic of services, of goods, of people. But on the other hand, cultural and thus linguistic variety is important for Europe. This principle was adopted in the Treaty of Maastricht, 1992. There we have the cultural paragraph, Article 128. And it gave countries the possibility to protect and stimulate their own cultural identity. I was one of the co-authors of this paragraph. That's why I'm wearing my tie, because otherwise. And at the same time, they adopted an educational paragraph that also says that languages, mother tongues are important. The treaties of Amsterdam, the Treaty of Lisbon, they all strengthened this principle that the European Union respects the cultural and linguistic diversity. So European countries are allowed to subsidize their films, their books, their TV programs, their works of art, their theaters, even if this hinders to a certain extent free trade, in the sense that it could be a distortion of competition when you subsidize things. Different member states also demanded that this cultural exception, as we call it, should be inserted in the transatlantic trade and investment partnership that is being negotiated now for the moment between Europe and the United States. Internationally, there are quite some instruments, not only to protect different languages as such, but also to protect the smaller languages, or languages that are only used in certain regions. You see some here, I think. Perhaps you know them better than I do. The last one is the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities that implies certain rights for minorities in the field of culture, education, radio, television, and language. And this one is a hot political item in Flanders and in Belgium. Belgium signed this convention in 2001, but the Flemish region never has. Flanders refuses to sign this because it fears that signing this treaty would endanger this principle of territoriality with language zones and borders. Problem in Belgium, ladies and gentlemen, is that the French are very imperialistic. You won't believe it, but it's true. They are not good neighbors, because they constantly want to move the fence. You know, you have the fence between them. Constantly want to move the fence. So before you know it, your French neighbor is sleeping in your bed with your wife. Yes, that's what happens. So they're not good neighbors. It's dangerous. They are very dangerous, French people. That's why we won't sign this treaty, but Spain has already signed in 1995, so perhaps for the Basque people this is a good thing, I don't know. But let us say something about language used as an instrument to organize society. That's what I was planning to do, coming here. In fact, we constantly expect people to comply with language conditions. In job advertisements, for instance, language is a relevant criterion. You can ask people to know a certain language in order to obtain a job. Language, mind you, is not the same as race, it's not the same as ethnic background. One can learn a language, so what's the problem? Flemish and Belgian law state that one mustn't discriminate on the basis of language, which is logic, but one can use language criteria if one can motivate. Sometimes that's a difficult discussion, as said not so this morning. I think this motivation is important. Flanders uses the condition of knowing Dutch as a criterion to augment the chance of finding a job, to integrate in a community, to keep certain areas livable. So our motives to ask that people know Dutch are not merely linguistic or cultural, but also social. If people can communicate with each other and understand each other, people feel safer, solidarity grows, etc. After a struggle, ladies and gentlemen, struggle of many, many years, today in Flanders, Dutch must be used by the public administration, by the courts, in education and in enterprises. Some instruments Flanders uses involving language criteria have been taken to Belgian courts, to international committees, to the European Court by the French in Belgium. And let us have a look perhaps at some language laws and at the creation of national and international, at the reaction of national and international courts and institutions. We will have a look at courts, education, companies, the administration, housing, minimum living wages, interesting, and some other fields. Courts in Flanders, we can be brief on that, courts in Flanders have to use the Dutch language. In Brussels it should be Dutch or French, okay. And you also can ask for an interpreter. Education in kindergarten, in primary and in secondary school, Dutch must be used. There are a few exceptions, but not worth mentioning. Also, universities and institutions for higher education have to use Dutch. But I must admit, in higher education, more and more courses are taught in English. To attract more foreign students, they say, to attract more foreign students and also to give Flemish students more chances on the international market. In the Netherlands, not in Belgium, in the Netherlands, some universities nowadays are only use English, are exclusively in English. In Flanders, this is still impossible. Last year we adopted a new law. I say law, but in fact in Flanders we have decrees, but let's say law. But in fact law is Belgian, decree is Flemish. So we adopted a new law to allow more English at university, but still there are restrictions. All Flemish universities together are allowed to have 6% of the bachelor courses in another language, which is English. And as far as the master courses are concerned, the maximum is 35%. We see that regulations are becoming less and less strict. I wrote 2 reports on that matter with an interval of 10 years, and it is very clear that Dutch really loses ground at university and English wins. Enterprises in Flanders have to use Dutch in all spoken or written communication with employees and in all official documents. In Brussels, companies have to make documents in Dutch for their Flemish employees and in French for their French-speaking employees. In practice, companies often use English. I'm not used to drink water, that's why. In practice, companies often use English. As far as the law is concerned, which obliges companies to use Dutch in Flanders, here the European Court said last year, 2013, the European Court says that this law obstructs the free traffic of people and services. And according to the European Court, the solution is to make two versions of the text. You have your contract in Dutch, but you also have to use another language. So Flanders has to adapt today a law that we already have for 40 years, since 1973. Public administration in Flanders, the government, provinces and municipalities communicate with their citizens in Dutch. This is also the case for semi-public authorities, for instance, public transport, buses, trains, and for companies working for public authorities. In principle, people also have to use Dutch in their contacts with the authorities, for instance, if they want a construction permit. A plan must be in Dutch. If it is not, it's rejected. But in practice, I must say, Flemish often are very tolerant to adapt to others. We see it as a matter of courtesy. But if we do that, if we speak another language, we do that because we want to. We do not want to do that because we have to. That's our character. Speaking about administration, perhaps I should say something now about Brussels, the bilingual capital of Belgium, and the Flemish municipalities surrounding it. In Brussels, both Dutch and Flemish are official languages, and civil servants, doctors and nurses in hospitals, etc., they should know both languages. In reality, they often don't. They often know only French. Some say this is logic, as the Dutch-speaking people in Brussels are a minority. This is not really correct. I already said it. Brussels used to be a Flemish city, that's one. But second, Flemings have the majority in Belgium, but on the road to self-government, we gave it up. We gave up this majority. There are a lot of mechanisms within the Belgian government and parliament to make it impossible that the Flemish majority would impose its will on the French minority. We gave up this majority in Belgium on condition that, as a compensation, Flemish would not be discriminated in Brussels. So this is important for us. The French domination in Brussels also affects the Flemish communities surrounding Brussels. More and more French-speaking people, also people working for international organizations and companies in Brussels, these people come and live in the nice, green, calm, safe communities surrounding Brussels. And in some of these municipalities, the French-speaking people obtained special language rights. We call them municipalities with language facilities. So they are allowed to demand official documents. They can ask for education, primary education, etc. in French. Flemings always thought that this measure would be temporarily, but the French think that these measures are forever. So this pressure of the French on the Flemish communities goes on and on. In some Flemish municipalities around Brussels, Brussels is the blue and the yellow, in some of these municipalities, Flemish municipalities, Dutch-speaking municipalities, French say that up to 50% of the people there today are French. So they got these special language rights. But as I said, French always want to move the fence, so it never stops. I will have to talk a bit faster, or I'll leave some things behind. So, for instance, when there are elections, people in these communities, they get their papers in Dutch, but the French can ask for a French version. Flemish say, okay, if you need the French version, ask for it, and you'll get it. French say, no, if we have asked once in our lifetime, then we should always get these documents in French. So this is also a discussion. We also have, but it's a bit complicated, but we have these Flemish communities, and in some of these Flemish communities, we have mayors that are French, and they refuse to speak Dutch. So our government, Flemish government, does not want to appoint these mayors. So of course they protest, and the Council of Europe said Flanders is wrong. We have to appoint these mayors in Flemish cities, although they refuse to speak French. Although they refuse to speak Flemish in the municipality, in the board, in the community council. Housing, that's interesting. These are language facility communities, you see in green. We have them around Brussels and also the border between Flanders and Wallonia. Housing, as far as housing is concerned, Flanders asks that immigrants learn Dutch if they want to rent a social house since 2008. That way they can understand what is written in the contract, they can understand safety rules, etc. in the building, they can communicate with their neighbors and with the authorities. And the Flemish government offers free courses in Dutch for immigrants. The government of the French community in Belgium and the League for Human Rights turned to the Constitutional Court in Belgium and opposed the law. Belgian constitutional law said the law was okay, but the Committee Against Racial Discrimination of the United Nations did not agree. Fortunately, the committee cannot condemn, but only express its concern. So it has no legal consequences, but the image of Flanders abroad was severely damaged at that time. Some municipalities also ask people to learn the language when they want to buy a social plot. So Flemish rules say when you want to rent, to hire, but some municipalities go further and they say no, also when you want to buy a house here, you have to know Dutch. Normally, we ask people to learn Dutch, but we do not test them. But some municipalities do test them, do examine them. If you test them, it is clearly felt to be discrimination. If you only ask them to learn the language, to do the effort, then it is not felt to be a discrimination. European Commission did ask us to motivate, of course. In the field of housing, we also have what is called the law living in one's own region, in one's own environment. And this law says that in a limited number of municipalities, 69 on a total of 308, municipalities where we have a strong pressure on the market of houses, priority should be given to people who can prove that they have a link with the area. For instance, that they have been living there for some years, that they work there, that they have children there going to school there. This way we want to help young people, especially young people, to buy a house in their own region. I live at the coast side, and I used to be deputy mayor responsible for housing and spatial planning, and where I live, prices of houses and building plots have really become very, very high as a result of people coming from Brussels and buying something there, people from abroad, Germans, buying houses there. So local young people cannot compete with these wealthier guests who often buy a property as a second residence, and they come and live there when they are retired. Some municipalities at the coast side, we see it here, have more second residences than permanent houses. So the orange is second residences, the gray is permanent residences. You see that there are some municipalities where we have much more second residences than permanent residences. This also means that our population grows older, because these are people that are retiring and coming there, older, and that there are not enough young people left to keep the region livable. So for us, the fact that we want to give priority to these young people is a social matter. Here you see the prices of houses in my community tripled in 10 years' time, and the next slide prices of building plots 4 or 5 times as high as 10 years ago. This priority for people with a link with the area does not apply to all houses or building plots, but just to zones that are, it's a bit difficult, excuse me, just to zones that are expansion building areas. These are reserve plots which normally you can't build on, but in certain circumstances, if you can prove that you really need these plots, then you can use this reserve. So it's limited to these zones. And as I said, it's also only the fact in a limited number of municipalities, communities surrounding Brussels, in the border area with Netherlands, and in the coastal region. In Belgium, the State Council agreed to this priority rule, when you can show that you have a link with the area. But again, the French started action, and after a negative advice of the European Court in May last year, the Belgian Constitutional Court recently said that the law is not okay. This was in November 2013. The law is active. It was adopted in 2006, active since 2008. So now it is annihilated, it's annulled retroactively, which means that hundreds of people who could not buy a house because they could not show that they had a link with the region. In fact, these hundreds of people can now sue the Flemish government and ask compensation for damage. Flemish government now tries to adapt the law, and we could do that, for instance, by adding the condition that people do not only have to, they do not only need a link with the region, but that they also must have a moderate income or a low income. If we combine these two, then Europe would agree. So perhaps this is the solution. Yes, because I say reserve areas, you see what's red here? These are just zones where you can build. It's my community. If you have a good look, you can see me from above. So red, these are zones where everybody can build, no problem. But then the white with red stripes, these are reserve zones, and in these zones you have to prove that you have a link with the region if you want to buy there. Okay. So we do not agree that these are racist laws or laws that favor people on the basis of nationality or ethnic criteria. No. Language is a criterion. The link with the area is a criterion. And everybody, also immigrants or people with other languages, with other cultures, can learn the language and can develop a link with the area, we think. People that come and live in Flanders and want to obtain a financial support from the municipality, what we call minimum living wages for people who have no income, they too should do an effort to learn Dutch. The Flemish government organizes courses for these people, and again, we ask them to learn Dutch. We do not have examinations, so it is an obligation that they take a commitment, that they make an effort, but we do not oblige them to reach a certain result. If we just ask them, it's okay. If we would examine them, it would not be okay for Europe. As I said, perhaps earlier, some municipalities did ask that people prove that they know Dutch, but this is a difficult matter. The European Commission asked for a motivation. Perhaps some examples, and then I'll have to finish, some examples of other fields using language criteria. We have municipalities that adopted the rule that children should be able to speak Dutch in order to be accepted for after-school childcare or childcare during the holidays. Flemish government said, no, you can't do that, annul this rule. Some municipalities said, well, in markets, if you sell things, this should be in Dutch. There too, Flemish government said, no, that's going too far, you mustn't do that. Also in other countries, there are language criteria. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have a very strong example. Do I have time to, or do I, no? Nah. No, but it's a nice example. Just give you that one. You had there was a girl, and she wanted to become a hairdresser. You know, some girls want to become a hairdresser. It's not my fault. And she brought her model, her mother as a model to cut her hair for the examination. The mother only spoke Spanish, not Dutch. So the school said, this is not acceptable. This model, even if she just has to sit there, has to speak Dutch. And the commission, not the European Commission, but the Dutch Commission said, okay, the school is right, because it's very important that the hairdresser can communicate, interact with her client. So, indeed, she must be able to speak Dutch. Perhaps another example, in the coastal zones in Denmark, I was told that foreigners cannot buy a property there. A zone of 500 meters in Denmark, near the coast, as a foreigner, you cannot buy a property. And they say that Europe accepted that when they became a member of the European Union. They said, okay, we'll accept that. And then, the conclusion perhaps, Mr. Chairman. In Belgium and Flanders, the last 150 years, we have voted rules and laws in order to give the Dutch language, being the language of the Flemish, the majority of the people in Belgium, to give that language the same rights as the French language, being the language of the minority in Belgium. So in Belgium, the majority was protected with instruments that are normally used to protect a minority. It's a bit complicated. The process of Europeanization and globalization, accompanied by large-scale migration, puts a high pressure to the concept of having homogeneous language reasons. Measures taken in favor of the mother tongue in a certain region are easily qualified to be old-fashioned or even discriminating. That way, many of our measures protecting or stimulating our language breathing space, if I will use that word, are contested in courts and committees, both nationally and internationally. Sometimes the laws or measures survive, sometimes they don't. It's important that the condition to use a language does not imply a discrimination on the basis of race or ethnic elements. The easiest way, perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, would be to give in and to let things happen, let things take their course. But the results could be that the strongest survives and that our smaller languages and cultures disappear. And sometimes I have the impression that young people wouldn't really care much if that would happen, or perhaps better, they are less afraid that it would happen. As for me, I am convinced that taking action in favor of our language and culture remains necessary. Safeguarding our language, be it Dutch or be it Basque, is, I think, our contribution to a colorful Europe. Thank you. Ahur.
Eskerrik asko, Wilfried. Bueno, egia esan ikuspegi askotatik Galesek eta Euskal Herriak badituzte antzekotasun ugari, ez da? Antzeko edadura daukagu, ezagutza tasa egia da gurean altuagoa dela, baina bueno, ez dago alde oso handia bien artean. Eta egia da, Galesen, hizkuntzaren lurralde Arnasguneek hizkuntza berreskurapen prozesuan duten garrantziaren kontzientzia aspaldi hartu zutela, ez? Bai, bueno, Inglaterrako gobernuak hartu dituen hainbat erabakien ondorioz, bai, bueno, Gales ere oporretarako gune bihurtu izan delako, Bagia da, Galeseko lurraldeak biziki pairatu duela haien lurraldetik kanpoko migrazio mugimendua, gehien bat Inglaterratik joaten ziren herritarrena, ez da hango gizarteragileek hainbat kanpaina egin izan dute, kolonizaziorik ez, edo Gales ez dago salgai, edo halako leloekin. Eta era berean, nahiko entzunak izan dira bertan, jabetza lege berezituen aldeko aldarria, eta baita lurraren erabilerako politiketan eta planifikazioen aplikazioak zehaztean galeza ere kontuan hartu beharreko elementuen hartzeko eskaera. Eta horrexegatik gaur hemen partekatu nahi genuen hirugarren adibidea edo galesekoa zan eta horretarako Mirion Davis ekarri dugu. Egia da, Gales ekarri nahi genuen, baina bestaldetik gizarte eragileen ahotsa ere ekarri nahi genuen, beste biak, Wilfried gizarte mugimenduen bigitakoa, baina gaur egun politikari profesionala, Elizabethek politikan diardu, eta nahi genuen beste ahoz bat ere hemen egon zedin, eta Mirionek hori beteko du, gizarte eragileen ahotsa. Kimetiza zirgaiz, Galesaren aldeko presio talde bateko eskualde antolatzaile izan zen, horren ostear Menter Jazkongui erakundean lan egiteari ekin zion, erakunde horren helburua hizkuntza toki herri komunitate mailan indartzea da, eta erakunde horretako lehen langile izan zen, eta gaur egun erakunde horreia 15 pertsona dituela lanean. Horretaz gain, Ziguaiz erakundearen lehendakari ere bada, erakunde horrek etxe bizitza, hizkuntza eta lana eskemaren baitan egiten du lan, eta etxe bizitza soziala, galeza eta negozioak uztartzen dituzte. Gaur egun, galezaren lan merkatu plana garatzeko lanean diardu, hain zuen ere, galez hiztunen kanporako migrazioa gutxiagotzeko eta galezaren bidezko zerbitzuak handitzeko. Eta azkenik, toki garapenaren aurkako talde baten ere parte hartzen du. Orduan ikusten duzuenez, erregintza biziki ongi ezagutzen du Mirionek eta beste barik berari emango diotitza.
Haupa, arratsaldeon, mila eskera ondagon Dita se agastic? No, not so dangerous. Thank you very much for inviting me here. We also have complaints in Wales that frogs and squirrels are more valued than Welsh speakers and Welsh-speaking communities. I've entitled the presentation today in Welsh, Cynllunio yng Nghymru ar Gymraeg, methiant mwyaf y mudiad iaith. Or in my other language, planning in Wales and the Welsh language, the language movement's biggest failing. And I think this, from the discussion this morning, what I'm going to say today perhaps is going to reiterate what we heard this morning. We've been quite successful in Wales with status, education and so on, but these are quite, in a way, easy things to win because you are giving people rights. With the planning, perhaps it's more of it, sometimes it can be seen as an issue where you're taking rights away from people. So it's a difficult one, and it's very complex and a bit boring. So that's perhaps why we haven't succeeded so much with it. I work for Menter Iaith Conwy. This is the shape of the region I work in. And there is a Menter Iaith in every county in Wales, every region, and we're a part of the Menter Iaith Cymru organisation. And we work in different ways to promote, to strengthen the language in the community through activities or through economic programs. This is our flag. Can I have the pointer? So we're here. Yeah, can you see? So we're here now, but I'm from here.
And now you can show the old line and
Around there somewhere? There?
The blue spot between Sweden and Finland.
Up there?
Down there.
That's it, yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think there's a lot of similarities between where I'm from, Cymru, and here. These T-shirts are very popular in Wales, and it says Cymraeg, which is Welsh, yeah? And it says, like I don't know if you have the Heineken advert, probably the best beer in the world. But under here it says, probably the oldest living language in Europe. I'm glad they put probably, because I think Basque would probably win, but Welsh is quite old. So here are the similarities. It's getting a bit embarrassing now that you're starting to get ahead of us in the percentage. And we have the same colors as well. Historically, Welsh is spoken through, well, a lot of what's now called Britain, the pink area here. That's from about 500 AD. So I'll give you a very, very quick historical context. I won't go through them, you can read them quickly yourself. But basically we lost sovereign independence in 1282. Before that we had our own legal system. And then we had, I'm sure you're quite familiar with this kind of stuff yourself. It's these kind of things which have taken the status away from the language. This is more recent, again, using the education system to get rid of the Welsh language, where children were forced to wear this piece of wood called the Welsh knot, and whoever wore this at the end of the day was beaten if you were here speaking Welsh. This was introduced at a time where the majority of the country was still monoglot Welsh speaking. So after this was introduced, we start to see a decline in the use of the language. But this is what the report said. The Welsh language is a vast drawback to Wales and a manifold barrier to the moral progress and commercial prosperity of the people. It is not easy to overestimate its evil effects. So we have also been quite heavily industrialized in the Industrial Revolution. In one sense, this kept the language in the country because we saw a lot less outward migration, that's what happened in Scotland and Ireland. So the Welsh language is in a much stronger situation than the other Celtic languages. And by 1911, we were down to about half the population. Again, these are things that we have won in the last century. They're all things which give to people status, things to use Welsh in the courts, Welsh medium schools. And then in 1962, Cymdeithas Iaith was formed after a famous radio announcement, which campaigned more vigorously for Welsh status. Signage, for example. This is a picture of people who had taken the signs down and then taken them to the police station, I think. This is the symbol for Cymdeithas Iaith. It's actually the tongue of the dragon. You know the dragon on the flag? It represents the tongue. So again, we see more gains, a lot of different things: television, radio, status, even a national language strategy. So to bring us to today, we have a new language law which says Welsh is an official language in Wales. There is no official language in Britain because there is no constitution. So Wales is an official language in Wales, but English isn't. It's just the de facto majority language. So we've also had a new national language strategy, but at the same time we had our census results were slightly disappointing, with 20,000 less Welsh speakers than there were in the previous census. This is, I think, a lot of this is because of outward immigration. Our relationship with England, because Paul was telling you now, Wales generally is quite a rural country. It's quite nice. The weather isn't so good, but it's quite nice. Opposed to a lot of England, which is not that nice to live in. So people tend to want to come to live in Wales. But we're much poorer than England, so it's easier for people from England to buy houses. The same situation with Germany, I suppose, with what Wilfred is talking about now. So I'll come to planning more specifically. There have been some historically very bad planning when the language has been, in this case, where whole communities have been moved, Welsh-speaking communities. And these are just some of the examples of when this has happened. So our relationship, the Welsh language, doesn't have a very happy relationship with the planning process, because all these things were allowed to happen. Despite people protesting. Also, what has historically, because of this, second homes have been a big problem, because we're also a coastal area, so there has been a lot of resentment for people not being able to buy properties in their own villages, and this sort of boiled over in the 1980s, when a lot of holiday homes were burnt as a protest. So these housing booms have had quite a bad effect on our, what we call, breathing spaces. And there have been campaigns to try and alleviate it. This is a sign, for example, which one organisation used to actually put on houses which were for sale to tell people it wasn't for sale. This is another sticker, it's like a poster people used, asking for no colonization. But what it does show, it shows the map in 1961. All the dark areas are 80% Welsh speaking. So it's what you would call breathing areas. So by 2001, it had gone down to just this part. We still have like the 60% Welsh-speaking areas, but the very high percentage areas are disappearing because of outward immigration and inward migration. If you look at the people who were born in these areas, for example, the region I live, Gwynedd, if you look at the indigenous population, 90% of the indigenous population still, they speak Welsh. It's about 70% overall, so it's the immigration and the outward immigration which is having an effect. This is the map from the last census, which shows where we have now our 70% areas left. This is where I live here. That actually went up a bit. I don't know if it was just because of me, but on my work. But what we have seen is that the areas where Welsh percentage has gone up, it's a mix of good planning, employment, education. It's a mix of all these things together. In this area called Gwynedd, you won't get a job with the local authority unless you speak Welsh. And the local authority employs 8,000 people. So, you know, it has a big effect on the area. So what we see here is the number of 70% plus communities. So 91, 87, 59, so we're now down to 49. This is a map of, graph of what's happened to the Welsh language over the last century. So you can see at the start of the century we were about close to 1 million, but by now we're about 500,000. So we've lost about 1/3 of our speakers in numbers, but we've become 1/5 of the population. So again, immigration is obviously having an effect here. Here we see the number of monolingual Welsh speakers. So if you go back 100 years, we had 250,000, but by now we don't have, apparently we don't have any, but obviously we still have children who can't speak English. My children are 1 and 4, and they're absolutely hopeless with English. So at the moment. But I know even if I lock them up in a cupboard until they're 15, they will still come out speaking English, because the influence of English is so strong. So people have been looking for answers to this. We've had housing associations set up which prioritize local people, but we've run into problems here because often the criteria is marked on your social needs, so you can have people from outside the area because they have larger or more serious problems. They can have a house quicker than someone who's lived in the area all their life. Cymdeithas Iaith then have been campaigning for a property act to kind of alleviate this problem, the housing problem. We can see here just one demonstration where for sale signs have been taken down. So these are basically the main principles of a property act, that any development should assess for local need first. There should also be housing for rent, help for first-time buyers, priority for local people, and planning for the community, which takes in the linguistic aspect. And also reassessing old planning permission, which has been there for years, perhaps. So after all this campaigning, by 1988, we were given this little note from the Welsh office. The Welsh office existed before we now have a National Assembly, but the Welsh office existed before that, and it was basically, Wales was administrated by a Secretary of State who was usually an English MP. But since 1997 we have devolution. So here we see that the Welsh language has become a material planning consideration. So people, from that point onwards, people are allowed to look at the Welsh language as a planning consideration. But by 97, we had our own, we had devolution, and planning comes within our parliament now, so it's been devolved to Wales. But in 2004, a search of appeal cases revealed only 27 appeal decisions in the past 18 years where the Welsh language had been considered. So even though it had been considered, no one was making any use of it. And this is just one sort of case a successful case we know of which stopped the building of 59 houses. This is the important part. This is what the inspector said, the planning inspector who passes the application or not. Whilst I am satisfied that the physical services could accommodate development on this scale, I share the concern of the local residents on the ability of the community to absorb continued increase of development on a relatively large scale. That is, it would have a detrimental effect on the Welsh language. So there are a few cases where we have won. We now have what's called a technical advice note. It's not law, but it's to advise people what to do with planning in Welsh language issues. But unfortunately, again, no one is making any use of it. It's not something you have to do. It's not statutory. So because of this, a group of organizations came together to create a language assessment, impact assessment criteria, something perhaps which has been talked about today, in the same way that you have an environmental impact assessment. In this case, with developments, if the local authority wants, they can ask a development to give a language statement, is the first step, where you describe where you think, as a developer, how your development will affect the Welsh language. So this is a very simple statement. But if people think this statement is going to lead to a detrimental effect, then they have to do a full language assessment impact. So, for example, this is what the assessment, one of the questions the assessment would ask. Is the policy plan programme likely to lead to a population decrease that might affect the balance of English Welsh speakers in a negative or positive way, or lead to an absolute proportional decline in the number of Welsh speakers? So people need to look at that. So that's, I think, one of the biggest questions. And then there are a lot of other questions which are linked with employment and so on. Then, you put all these answers together to mark them, and then, depending on the mark, if it's a positive effect, it will be marked 1. If it's neutral, it's 0. Or if it's negative, it's -1. I'm not going to go into this into too much detail, because it's very detailed. I'll just quickly show you the kind of questions you see in these kind of assessments. They're quite there's not much social-linguistic understanding in questions, I feel. It just looks at percentages. It doesn't look at the relationship or the use of Welsh language within the community. So if the assessment says that the impact is going to be negative, then the local authority will ask the developer to introduce mitigation, some kind of mitigation steps to make the effect less detrimental, less bad. So these are the kind of things which could happen. Phasing the number of houses to be built, so they're not all built at the same time. Provision of affordable housing for local needs, where you can actually stipulate a house can only be bought by local people. Agreements to provide for people on the local housing register, employment, local labour contract, so that you employ a local builder to a local smaller company to build the houses. support for local skills training initiatives, provision of bilingual signs within and outside the establishment. Also education, perhaps the setting up of a Welsh medium school. Support and funding for language induction, staff language lessons, for example, language plans and immersion units. Support and funding for cultural and language initiatives, projects to encourage the use of language within communities. I think this can be a bit dangerous, especially for an organisation like myself, because we would probably get money to do these things, but it would probably be not a lot of money considering the development. So it's kind of a way of buying people. So unless they're going to give, unless the development is very small and the mitigation measure is very big, that's only when you can consider this. But there are all kinds of stories of developers not paying this kind of money in environmental cases. So I don't think they would pay all the time in language cases also. Between 2011 and 13, only 3 local authorities of the 25, there are 25 local authorities in the country, had completed a language assessment. So 16 out of 50,000 applications, that's a very, very small percentage. Again, it's not statutory to do these. It's the local authority if they want to or not. In 2009, there was a nationalist and a socialist coalition government, and the nationalists tried to have the TAN 20 reviewed. It's taken them it's only just come out this year, so it's taken 4 years, and really it hasn't been, this has been the focus of a lot of the language movement in the last 2-3 years to get this out. But the result has been not a good result. They want to do the assessment when the local authority plans what they're going to do for the next 15 years, how much land they're going to use for development. They say the assessment should be done at this point rather than individual when applications come in. So some local authorities have already planned to do assessments when individual applications come in. So this kind of undermines the situation. I was in a meeting on Monday and in the authority where I work, in the planning department, and they were going to do this. So one of the first things they say in their planning document is, we will protect the Welsh language. But it was discussed around the table, well, we're lying because we're not doing it, because of the system. Well, one of the local representatives said we were lying to one of the planning officers, which I don't think the planning officer was very happy. Yeah, so again, we have the infrastructure levy. Again, I see it as a way of perhaps developers buying their way into getting the development done by giving us a few crumbs to try and strengthen the language. And they still have not developed, the government have still not developed a clear tool, assessment tool. It's something they're still working on now. And it should be out sometime, I don't know when. So the problem with local development plans, population growth figures given by the Planning Inspectorate, which is based in England, to the Welsh Government, and then divided amongst the local authorities. These projection figures are usually, there's some kind of formula, but they usually use when the housing market is up to project population figures for the next 15 years. So in the Welsh Government has been given 320 houses to be built over the next 20 years. The 2001 census revealed that 90% of the population growth in Cymru, or Wales, was due to in-migration largely from England. Therefore, the actual figure for indigenous increase is closer to 32,000, not 320,000. So, I think perhaps from what I've seen today, theoretically we have perhaps advanced a bit more than here, but practically it's a disaster. So it doesn't work. So why? Well, I think principally language planners don't understand planning issues, and planners do not understand language issues. So we need someone who understands both to make this work. There is a basic lack of understanding of basic social-linguistic issues. If you mix a monolingual population, a new monolingual population of a high-status language, with bilinguals who their first language is a low status, it's not rocket science to know what's going to happen. The English language will win. It's these kind of things that are not considered. I've tried to talk to developers who want to build houses, and I've told them, do you realize this is going to have a bad effect on the Welsh language? And they look at me. It's like, I know how, if I was a climatologist sitting down trying to explain global warming to a huge oil company, it's the same response. But by now, the climatologists have got evidence that things are changing. And I think that's what we need to do more, is to have documented cases of this is what's happened, the language has gone up or it's gone down. There are cases where local needs have been measured properly, and a small number of houses have been built, and the percentage of Welsh speakers have gone up. So there are evidence of where planning can be used to increase the percentage, but there is too much anecdotal evidence of where development has completely changed the linguistic scenario totally because of too many houses. Also, the language issue does not carry enough weight in the planning process. I mean, it sounds good, but very few applications will be turned down because on language grounds solely. Usually campaigners try to use other things like road infrastructure as well as language issues to object to development. Also, I don't think there's any political will centrally in the government. And the number of housing projections are much too high for us. There's no understanding of the linguistic scenario in Wales, in England. A few things are being done. To tackle the second home scenario, local authorities are now going to start, the local authority where I live are going to start asking for 200% tax. So this will stop as many local houses going as holiday homes, because some of the villages in the region where I live, some of the coastal villages, half the houses are empty all year. Also, I think there's more cohesion now with local groups fighting to develop plans locally, and people are starting to understand they need to have an evidence-based framework rather than just objecting to new houses because they're new houses. They need to say why, and they need to say it will have a detrimental effect and prove that it will have a detrimental effect on the language. Also, because planning is devolved, there is a new planning bill being drawn up, a new planning law being drawn up in Wales at the moment. What usually happens when an application is put forward, very often it will be refused the first time. But when it goes to appeal, the local authority are frightened that they will lose and will be sued, because the Welsh language doesn't have any legislative foundation, only policy. So the language movement now is lobbying very hard in Wales on the government to make the Welsh language a part of the new planning bill. And also that will make sure that there is an independent body to look at planning applications, the effect on the Welsh language. Because the current system, it's the developer that puts in the language assessment. So even if there is a language assessment, they'd probably say that it's going to do the language good. There are examples where 2 or 3 language assessments have been made on one village, where the developer says, yes, it's going to have a really good effect on the language. Building 300 houses in a village of only 300 houses is going to have a good effect on the Welsh language. But the villagers have made their own language assessment, and of course that says, no, it's going to have a really bad effect. So it needs to be independent. Language assessments need to be independent. So there is a language commissioner now in Wales, so I think that every time there's a language assessment, it should go to the language commissioner to do this independently. I don't think the level of expertise exists within local authorities to do it, within planning authorities. So this will hopefully give the Welsh language more weight within the planning system. But also to encourage local authorities to turn down these really high population figures. Only one local authority in the whole of Wales and England has done this, is Cumbria, which is, you might know as the Lake District. They have created their own population figures, and it has been accepted. And I think we can bring the figures down and use language to justify lower figures because of the social linguistic effect. These are the names of just perhaps 4 villages at the moment, or towns, which are fighting big developments. Bodalwyddan is only a town of 1,000 houses, but they want to build 2,000 houses there. Bethesda is where I live. It's about 6,000 people live there, but they want to build 80 new houses when there's already 120 empty houses in the village. Bangor is similar, and Bryn Aman is a very interesting example because it's somewhere in the south which the government itself has recognised an area where the language is in decline and something needs to be done, and they've employed 3 or 4 people to try and look at the problems in this area. So the government, on one hand, have invested in the area, but at the same time, the central policy has let a developer build 300 houses in this. So in one way, you're getting the government's trying to help the language in a very sort of not in a very, it's not a very structured way, and then completely undermining it with their own planning policies. We do have places in Wales which don't start with B. It's just that these all are. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Mila Esquer, but it's something we cannot avoid anymore. This is what the issue is in Wales now. We have succeeded to a degree with education, with status, but all the gains we have made in the last 50 years are being undermined by the planning process. So it's something we have to get right. And the more examples we have from across Europe of this kind of planning and this kind of work, I think the more acceptable it will be. I think people have been frightened to try and do something about it. And it's been much easier for us in Wales perhaps to put our heads in the sand and campaign on things which have been easier to win like status, education, television, and so on. But this is the really hard one to win. So I hope, and I would like to wish you good luck, because if you succeed, we will succeed also.
Eskerrik asko, Merion, eta, bueno, ohartu zaretenez, denbora gainean etorri zaigu, ez dakit, bueno, zalantzak egongo dira amaika, gutxienez galderak, zubatzen dut asko egongo dira, nik uste dute, bueno, elementu interesgarri asko atara dituztela, gainera, bueno, goizean esandakoarekin, bueno, hainbat gauza lotzen zaio goizean esandakoei. Kontua da hori, esandakoa, denboraz ja, txartu gabiltzea, ja pasatu egin zaigu, ez dakit, zeo zerre argitzeko, edo bestela, bueno, bihar, igual, zaitu, hain itzienko dugu, igual bihar tartetxo bat, bihar hauek hemen jarretuko dute, igual biharko 10 minutu utziko dugu, ados. Bueno, badago galderarik, zarantzarik, iradokizunik. Lehen esan bezan, ustez gauza asko da dira, gainera oso eredu desberdinak ekarrena izan ditugu, bat gehiago plangintzare berea gizarte mugimendua, eta hor dituzten arrakastak ere, arrakastaren materia azaldu Merione, baina ez ikuspegi etxigarretik, baina bai ikuspegi erraizta batetik. Nik apuntatu dut, goizean errepekatu diren gauzak, eragin linguistikoan eurtzeko zehar ere, bereiek ere horretan ari direla, korpus juridikoaren garrantzia, nik uste dute egon gaitezke dauz, kontra, baina ala nuarteetan, bestea beste, suedierak jarraitu izan badu, azkenengo mendean, horre korpus juridiko egokiak, bere biziko garrantzia hartu duela. Badago beste... Ez da argi eta...
Ni hasiko naiz, hasteko eskerrik asko emandako azalpenengatik. Eta duda bat, guk gai hau planteatu izan dugunean, hemen Euskal Herrian, lehenengo erantzuna sorpresaskoak izaten dira gai hau lehenago ere esan dut, eta gaia planteatzeagatik beragatik, eta hurrengoa izaten da erreparo handia, ez? Horrelako beldurra gai hau planteatzeari. Nolabaiteko zaintza geurea lehenestea eta zaintzea, konplejorik gabe geure hizkuntza, geure lurrean, ez da. Are gehiago, leporatu izan digute ideia horiek izan daitezkela baita ultraeskuinaren ideiak, ez da. Badakit, hortaz ere bereziki Flandrian eta hori badakitela zer den, baina jakin nahi nuke ere Galesen gai hau planteatu denean nola hartua izan den, edo nola hartzen duten bertakoek bereziki, ja ez inglesek, baizik bertakoek. Hori.
Push, yeah. Yeah, this is something that worries people. Well, the Welsh people don't want to be seen as, every time this usually has been brought up, people are accused of being extremists and so on. When the English talk about immigration, they talk about immigration from Europe or whatever, which, they're worried about the English language, but I don't think they have much place to worry. But when we talk about immigration in Wales, it's about English immigration to Wales. But yeah, one thing that perhaps stops people moving into an area is the fact that you have to speak Welsh to work somewhere, and also that all the education is through the medium of Welsh. This is true where I live. And sometimes you will get acquisitions saying, "Oh, if you say that you need Welsh for a job, well, that's racist." Well, we've discussed this already today, and it's a language, it's a skill. You wouldn't give someone a job if they couldn't count. So it's the same thing. But I don't think there are any real policies which are working good enough to get a reaction at the moment. I think that's the truth from English people. At the moment, you can see with the local authority where I work, we want to raise the tax on holiday homes to 200%. This is having some reaction, but I think it'll be okay. But that's the biggest issue at the moment.
The question was if there are any reactions from the majority, and of course in the Åland Islands we are the majority, so there are not any reactions in the Åland Islands, but there's always reactions in Finland, and many of these built on not knowing the history, not knowing the background, not understanding. And there is a party called the True Finns, who are playing a lot of the non-existent knowledge of history. And one of the MPs in this party, he made a statement a couple of years ago saying that he thought that all homosexuals and immigrants from Somalia should be sent to the Åland Islands, and then we would see what sort of model society that would be. Well, this I was asked to comment on it, and I said that everyone is welcome to the Åland Islands, even this MP. And he was then asked to apologize. This was quite a big affair. But recently, now during Christmas, one Swedish speaker, a journalist, he has made a similar statement, and that is even worse when it is someone from the Swedish speakers in Finland, where he is saying that Åland is absolutely not a model for anything, that there are no rights for the Finns there, and they are minorities from minority languages from all over the world. They are coming to the Åland Islands to study this, and they go back and think this inhumane solution is something to copy. And I was, for example, in December in Transylvania, and I think he's hinting on that, because he's saying that they go to Transylvania and to implement the Åland autonomy in Romania, in the Hungarian areas, would be like, you know, forbidding Romanian. And of course, I would never give such a simple explanation as you heard here. I try to explain that this is just one part of the autonomy solution in Finland. But we have all these reactions from the majority. If I may touch on another question that I left out because I thought I had already used too much time. This is what you were saying about the special restrictions in Denmark on bi-real estate, and that Denmark could have when they, at the accession. It was the same with Åland. We had our special protocol because everything is possible at the accession in the EU. Afterwards, nothing is possible. Now, Russia, they have implemented a few years ago a regulation saying that foreigners cannot buy real estate in Russia within 100 kilometers area along the border. This goes for all EU for foreigners. And this, of course, it implies mostly to Finns, and you know, many of them, they have their homes on the other side that they lost in the Second World War. It was at that point discussed in the Parliament, and it was agreed that this is a question for the European Union, not for Finland, because it is not against Finnish citizens, it's foreigners. Now there is an initiative taken during Christmas. I was not asked to sign this paper because I think they knew my reaction, but they have managed to gather a majority, which is 101 members of the Finnish Parliament, having signed this initiative, saying that Finland should regulate in the same way as Russia is, and they are then making reference to the Åland minority solution. And I have been asked afterwards by the newspapers if I would have signed it, and I'm of course saying no, I would not have signed it, because this is not a Finnish-Russian question. This will start a debate on this nationalistic, racist question. This is an issue for the European Union. It is against foreign citizens, and I think that the European Union should take responsibility when it comes to these questions and not let it down to the national level. And I think that this is the obligation of all of us, to try to raise this question at a European level, and not the European Union has to take responsibility when it comes to protecting languages and to such local measures.
Well, I think perhaps this is a good conclusion for today, but the key issue, I think, is that attacking the free market is extremely difficult. So, and that's what we are doing. And that's I think, the problem. Someone selling a house or a building plot wants to have the biggest profit. Everybody wants that. Even if he is a Flemish nationalist and he sells something, he wants to have the biggest profit. So if you say, okay, but you have to sell only to someone who can prove that he has a link with the region, etc., this becomes very difficult, because of course the number of people being able to sell then your candidates, there are less people who can buy, so the price will be lower. So for people selling, this is not pleasant. This is not pleasant, even not for a Flemish nationalist. And I think this is the real problem when we are trying to, and you said that, when you are trying to use these measures, for instance, in spatial planning, in restrictions in buying houses or renting houses, you are dealing with the free market and you are hurting people in their wallet. And that's, of course, very, very, very difficult.
Hamar minutuak joan dira, berriz ere. Bueno, printzipio saben utziko dugu, bihar 9:30, bueno, hasi egingo da, eta esagun bihar puntuan hastea, ez da gaur bezalako egun luzea izango, baina, bueno, gutxienez bihar ere nahiko trinkoa izango dela uste dugu. Eskerrik asko guztioi, eskerrik asko beste behin Wilfried, Merion eta Elisabezi, hona etortzea dira, bueno, bihar ere hemen izango dira, guan bestelako zalantzak argitzeko prest izango ditugu. Ondo izan eta bihar arte.